There is a specific, devastating silence that follows the destruction of a long-term marriage. It isn't the sound of shattering glass or screaming matches. It's the quiet click of a front door closing, the sudden echo in an empty hallway, the realization that the person who knew your soul has decided they prefer a shiny new stranger. They say the best revenge is a life well lived, but that is merely a comfort cooked up by the defeated. True revenge is absolute, undeniable reinvention. It is the moment the man who threw you away realizes that he didn't just lose a wife, he lost his only ticket to greatness, and he is forced to watch a better, wealthier, more powerful man claim the prize he carelessly left in the dirt. Iolanthe Sterling had always been a man who appreciated aesthetics above all else. As one of Manhattan's premier residential architects, his entire life was constructed around clean lines, perfect symmetry, and the flawless presentation of success. For 15 years, his wife, Clara, had been the cornerstone of that presentation. She was elegant, educated, endlessly patient, and possessed the kind of quiet, old-world grace that made Iolanthe's aggressive ambition palatable to the high-society clients he courted. But at 42, Clara had committed the one sin Iolanthe could not forgive. She had aged. It didn't matter that the silver threads in her chestnut hair caught the light beautifully, or that the faint lines around her eyes were drawn by a decade and a half of smiling at his terrible jokes. To Iolanthe, whose ego was beginning to panic at the sight of his own receding hairline and softening jaw, Clara was a mirror reflecting his mortality. He found his fountain of youth in Ivory Davenport. Ivory was 24, an assistant junior publicist at a firm Iolanthe hired for a branding overhaul. She was a whirlwind of iced coffees, TikTok trends, and breathless admiration. When she looked at Iolanthe, she didn't see the man who used to leave his wet towels on the floor, or the man who cried when his first firm went bankrupt. She saw a master of the universe. She stroked his ego with the unthinking enthusiasm of youth, and within 3 months, Iolanthe was entirely intoxicated. The discard was brutal in its clinical efficiency. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in November. Clara was in the kitchen of their sprawling Upper East Side penthouse, pouring a glass of Sancerre, when Iolanthe walked in. He didn't take off his cashmere coat. He stood by the marble island, looking everywhere but at her eyes. "I'm leaving, Clara," he said, his voice clipped, practiced. "I've instructed my lawyers to draw up the papers. I'll be staying at the pier for now." Clara froze, the wine bottle hovering over the glass. "Leaving? Iolanthe, what are you talking about?" "I'm suffocating." He relied on the cliché like a crutch. "We've grown apart. You're happy staying in, reading, going to your little gallery events. I need vitality. I need to feel alive again. I've met someone who understands the man I am today." Clara set the bottle down. Her hands weren't shaking. The shock was so profound it paralyzed her nervous system. "You're throwing away 15 years for a cliché, Iolanthe? A midlife crisis?" "Her name is Ivory," Iolanthe snapped, suddenly defensive, "and she makes me feel like I can conquer the world. You just manage me, Clara. I don't want a manager anymore." The divorce that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Iolanthe, desperate to fund the lavish lifestyle required to keep a 24-year-old entertained, fought tooth and nail for every penny. He hired a shark of a litigator who painted Clara as a lazy socialite who had contributed nothing to Iolanthe's firm, completely erasing the years Clara had spent editing his proposals, hosting dinners that secured his biggest contracts, and sacrificing her own career as an art historian to be his uncompensated partner. Rather than drag herself through the mud of public litigation, Clara settled. She took a modest lump sum and a small, somewhat dated apartment in Tribeca, relinquishing her claim to the penthouse, the Hamptons house, and the firm. When she handed over the keys to the penthouse, Iolanthe stood by the door with Ivory clinging to his arm. Ivory was wearing a pair of Clara's favorite designer sunglasses, a petty theft Iolanthe had clearly allowed. "I hope you find peace," Clara," Iolanthe said, adopting a tone of faux benevolence. Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the man she loved, but a hollow, terrified shell. "I will, Iolanthe," she said softly, "but I highly doubt you will." She walked to the elevator, her spine straight, leaving the ashes of her life behind. The first 6 months in the Tribeca apartment were a blur of grief and Earl Grey tea. Clara had to learn how to exist as a singular entity. She was no longer Iolanthe and Clara. She was just Clara Hayes again. The silence of the apartment was deafening, but slowly it transitioned from a haunting void into a peaceful sanctuary. Without the exhausting full-time job of managing Iolanthe's ego and social calendar, Clara found herself with a terrifying abundance of time and energy. She returned to her first love, art. Before Iolanthe, she had been a rising star at Sotheby's. She reached out to old contacts, swallowing her pride, and offered her services as an independent appraiser and private curator. Her keen eye and impeccable taste had not rusted. Within a year, Clara had built a quiet but fiercely loyal client base among Manhattan's genuinely wealthy elite, the kind of people who didn't flaunt their money on Instagram, but who quietly purchased uncatalogued Monets for their private studies. It was through this whispered network of old money that she was summoned to the estate of Arthur Kensington. Arthur Kensington was a ghost in the financial world. At 58, he was a billionaire several times over, having made his fortune in early-stage tech investments and rare earth minerals. He was notoriously private, completely absent from the tabloid circuit, and a widower of 5 years. He lived in a sprawling, historic limestone mansion on Fifth Avenue that looked more like a European embassy than a private home. Clara was hired to appraise and catalogue a collection of post-impressionist paintings Arthur had recently inherited from an eccentric aunt in Paris. Their first meeting was purely professional. Clara arrived in a tailored navy pantsuit, her hair pulled into a sleek chignon. She was ushered into the vast, oak-panelled library where the paintings were temporarily stored. Arthur was sitting in a leather wingback chair, reading a physical newspaper. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with thick silver hair and piercing, intelligent grey eyes. He possessed an aura of absolute, unshakable authority that didn't require raising his voice or puffing out his chest. "Mrs. Hayes," Arthur said, standing and extending a hand. His grip was firm, warm. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Miss Hayes, actually," Clara corrected gently, a small thrill of independence in the assertion. "And it's a pleasure, Mr. Kensington. The provenance files you sent were fascinating." For the next 3 hours, Clara lost herself in the work. She examined the brush strokes, cross-referenced the dates, and spoke aloud her observations, entirely forgetting that one of the most powerful men in America was watching her. When she finally turned around, wiping dust from her hands, she caught Arthur staring at her. Not at the paintings, but at her. "You have a remarkable mind, Clara," he said quietly. It was the first time in her life a man had complimented her intellect before her appearance. That professional appraisal stretched into weeks. Arthur began finding excuses to be in the library while Clara worked. He would have tea brought in, and their conversations drifted from Paul Cézanne to global politics, to philosophy, to their respective pasts. Clara found herself telling him about Iolanthe, the divorce, and the crushing betrayal, surprised by her own vulnerability. Arthur listened with an intensity that made Clara feel like the only person on earth. He didn't offer pity, he offered understanding. Men who build their self-worth on the youth of their partners are building houses on sand, Arthur remarked one afternoon, pouring her a cup of Darjeeling. They are terrified of women who have the wisdom to see right through them. He didn't leave because you weren't enough, Clara. He left because you were too much. You outgrew him. The transition from professional to personal was seamless, like deep water shifting with the tide. Arthur courted her, not with flashy sports cars or club VIP sections, but with profound respect and devastating romance. He took her to private symphonies in Vienna, chartered a yacht to explore the hidden coves of the Amalfi Coast, and most importantly, he championed her business. He loved her ambition. He loved her lines, her experiences, the depth of her laughter. Under Arthur's adoration, Clara didn't just heal, she bloomed. The stress that had hollowed her cheeks vanished. She invested in a new wardrobe, pieces that were daring, structural and fiercely elegant. She became a woman fully realized, armed with the love of a man whose power and wealth were dwarfed only by his devotion to her. And she kept it completely private. In Arthur's world, discretion was the ultimate luxury. Iolanthe, meanwhile, was drowning loudly in his own. 2 years had passed since the divorce. For Iolanthe Sterling, the shiny veneer of his new life was cracking, peeling and revealing rot underneath. Ivory Davenport, it turned out, was exhausting. What Iolanthe had initially perceived as vitality was actually an insatiable, bottomless need for stimulation and validation. Ivory didn't want to host intimate dinners for his older, wealthy clients. She wanted to go to loud, neon-lit clubs where Iolanthe felt ancient, standing in the corner holding an overpriced vodka soda. Ivory demanded a massive diamond ring, a sprawling loft in Soho that drained Iolanthe's liquidity, and constant vacations to places where she could take photographs of herself. Worse, Iolanthe's business was suffering. He hadn't realized until she was gone how much Clara had managed the delicate egos of his clientele. Without her graceful diplomacy, Iolanthe's natural arrogance rubbed people the wrong way. He had lost 3 major contracts in 6 months. His firm was bleeding money, and the financial strain was causing explosive, screaming arguments with Ivory. Salvation, Iolanthe believed, lay in a single event, the Kensington Winter Gala. Hosted by the notoriously reclusive billionaire Arthur Kensington, the gala was the most exclusive charity event in New York. A single table cost $250,000, and invitations could not be bought. They had to be extended. Securing a contract to design the new billion-dollar Kensington Tech campus in Austin would save Iolanthe's firm and secure his legacy. Through a desperate web of calling in old favors and aggressive networking, Iolanthe managed to secure 2 tickets from a board member who had suddenly fallen ill. "This is it, Ivory," Iolanthe told her in the back of their leased town car as they approached the Plaza Hotel. He nervously adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo. "Arthur Kensington is going to be there. I need you to be charming, sophisticated. No phones at the table. We need to look like the future of Manhattan architecture." Ivory rolled her eyes, adjusting the bodice of her bright pink, highly revealing sequined gown. "Relax, Richie. I know how to talk to rich old guys." Iolanthe winced at the nickname and the complete lack of understanding in her eyes. As they stepped onto the red carpet, dodging the flashes of high society photographers, Iolanthe felt a sickening wave of imposter syndrome. He looked around at the genuine titans of industry, the old money matriarchs in their understated Oscar de la Renta gowns, and felt acutely aware of Ivory's glaringly neon presence beside him. The grand ballroom of the plaza had been transformed into a winter wonderland of white orchids, crystal weeping willows, and thousands of floating candles. A string quartet played softly in the background. It was an atmosphere of impenetrable wealth. Iolanthe spent the first hour frantically scanning the room for Arthur Kensington, sweating through his custom shirt. He dragged a bored, complaining Ivory from group to group, offering his business card to people who clearly had no interest in him. At exactly 9 o'clock, a subtle shift occurred in the room. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations began to taper off, moving like a wave from the grand staircase at the entrance towards the back of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice echoed softly over the hidden speakers, "please welcome your host for the evening, Mr. Arthur Kensington, and his partner." Iolanthe pushed his way towards the front of the crowd, eager to catch a glimpse of the man he needed to manipulate, dragging a whining Ivory by the wrist. "Pay attention," he hissed. "This is him." Arthur Kensington appeared at the top of the grand marble staircase. He looked magnificent, exuding a quiet, lethal confidence in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. But Iolanthe barely registered the billionaire. All the air left Iolanthe's lungs. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold and dizzy. He stopped dead, his grip slackening on Ivory's wrist. Standing on the arm of the billionaire, looking down at the sea of Manhattan's elite, was Clara. But it wasn't the Clara he remembered. This woman was a goddess wrapped in custom, bias-cut emerald green silk that hugged every curve of her body and pooled like liquid glass at her feet. Around her neck sat a staggering antique diamond and emerald collar that caught the light of the chandeliers and threw it back into the room. Her hair was swept off her face in a modern, striking style, and her posture was that of a queen surveying her kingdom. She looked 10 years younger, radiantly beautiful, and impossibly powerful. Arthur leaned down, his face entirely devoted, and whispered something in Clara's ear. Clara let out a bright, genuine musical laugh, a sound Iolanthe hadn't heard from her in half a decade. Arthur smiled, kissed her cheek softly, and led her down the stairs. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. "Whoa," Ivory muttered, chewing on a piece of ice from her cocktail. "Look at the ice on that woman. Who is she?" Iolanthe couldn't speak. His throat was entirely closed. He felt as though the floor beneath his patent leather shoes had completely dissolved. As Arthur and Clara made their way through the crowd, accepting greetings and kissing cheeks, their path brought them directly toward where Iolanthe was standing, frozen in shock. Clara's eyes swept over the crowd and landed on Iolanthe. There was no shock in her gaze. There was no anger, no vindictiveness, and certainly no lingering heartbreak. Instead, as she looked at her ex-husband, standing next to his garish, bored young girlfriend, a flicker of mild, detached amusement crossed Clara's face. She looked at him the way one might look at a mildly interesting piece of lint on a beautiful coat. She didn't break her stride. She didn't look away. She held Iolanthe's terrified, devastated gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, offered a microscopic, devastating tilt of her head in acknowledgement, and glided right past him on the arm of a man who owned half the city. "Richie!" Ivory pulled his sleeve. "Richie, you look like you're going to throw up." Iolanthe stared at the emerald silk of Clara's dress disappearing into the crowd of billionaires and power brokers. The realization crashed down on him with the weight of a falling building. He hadn't just traded down. He had thrown away a diamond for a piece of broken glass, and now that diamond was sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the empire he had spent his entire life desperately trying to climb. The rest of the evening was a waking nightmare for Iolanthe. The plaza's grand ballroom, dripping in baccarat crystal and echoing with the polite chatter of the global elite, felt like a beautifully decorated torture chamber. He stood near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, nursing a glass of Macallan that tasted like ash in his mouth, entirely unable to look away from the epicenter of the room. The epicenter was Clara. She wasn't just attending the party. She was commanding it. Iolanthe watched in muted horror as Clara held court with people he had spent his entire career desperately trying to impress. He saw her laughing with the chairman of the Guggenheim board. He watched her speak fluent, rapid-fire French to a prominent European ambassador. Even Anna Wintour, notoriously icy and guarded, stopped to exchange a genuine, lingering conversation with Clara, eyeing the antique emerald collar with clear approval. Through it all, Arthur Kensington stood beside her, his hand resting securely on the small of her back. Arthur didn't look like a man showing off a trophy. He looked like a king who had finally found his queen. He deferred to her in conversations, actively drawing her into discussions about global markets and philanthropic initiatives. Beside Iolanthe, Ivory was growing increasingly agitated. She had downed 3 glasses of Veuve Clicquot and was complaining loudly about the lack of a designated photo booth. "Richie, this is so boring," Ivory whined, tapping her acrylic nails against her phone screen. "Nobody here is even famous. It's just a bunch of old people talking about taxes. Can we go to catch? My friends are at catch." "Shut up, Ivory," Iolanthe snapped, the words out of his mouth before he could stop them. Ivory gasped, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? Do not speak to me like that. I am wearing heels that cost more than your car lease right now." "Then act like you belong in them," Iolanthe hissed, his panic overriding his usual indulgence of her tantrums. "I am trying to save my firm tonight. I need to speak to Arthur Kensington." "Then go speak to him," she shot back, "but don't expect me to stand here looking like an idiot while you stare at your ex-wife." Ivory had noticed. Of course she had. Iolanthe's obsession was palpable. Summoning a reserve of false bravado he didn't know he had, Iolanthe adjusted his tie and began to navigate through the sea of tuxedoed billionaires and silk-clad socialites. He had to secure the Austin Tech campus contract. If he could just get Arthur's ear for 2 minutes, he could pitch his vision. He could prove he still had value. He timed his approach for a moment when the European ambassador stepped away. Arthur and Clara were momentarily standing alone, near a towering floral arrangement of white orchids. "Arthur, Mr. Kensington," Iolanthe projected his voice, aiming for booming confidence, but landing on strained desperation. He stepped into their orbit. Arthur turned, his piercing grey eyes locking onto Iolanthe. The billionaire's expression was perfectly blank, the kind of polite indifference reserved for valet attendants or overeager waiters. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Arthur said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that immediately made Iolanthe feel incredibly small. Before Iolanthe could speak, Clara turned. Up close, the transformation was even more devastating. Her skin was luminous, her eyes sharp and clear. The scent of her perfume, Baccarat Rouge 540, replacing the floral water she used to wear, hit him like a physical blow. "Arthur, darling," Clara said, her voice smooth as glass, completely devoid of tremor or hesitation. "This is Iolanthe Sterling, my former husband." Arthur's eyebrows rose an imperceptible fraction. A micro-expression of profound, icy understanding passed over his face. "Ah, Mr. Sterling, the architect. Clara has mentioned you." "She has?" Iolanthe asked, a desperate glimmer of hope lighting in his chest. Perhaps she had spoken of his talent. "Only in passing," Arthur replied smoothly, the subtle insult sliding in like a stiletto. "What can we do for you, Mr. Sterling? I imagine you aren't here simply to catch up." Iolanthe swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Actually, Mr. Kensington, I was hoping to discuss the new tech campus your holding company is developing in Austin. My firm, Sterling Associates, specializes in integrating modern corporate structures with sustainable, environmental aesthetics. I know you haven't selected a lead architect yet, and I'd love to formally submit a proposal." He reached into his breast pocket, intending to hand over a sleek, matte black business card. Clara let out a soft, melodic laugh. It wasn't cruel, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the laugh of someone genuinely amused by a child's misunderstanding. "Iolanthe," Clara said, stepping slightly forward, "put your card away." Iolanthe froze, his hand half out of his pocket. "Clara, please. This is business. I know we have our history, but my firm is uniquely suited for this. It is business, Mr. Sterling," Arthur interjected, his voice dropping an octave, the genial host routine vanishing to reveal the ruthless billionaire beneath. "Which is why I suggest you direct your pitch to the person actually making the decision." Iolanthe blinked, confused. "Your board of directors?" "No," Arthur smiled, looking down at Clara with a warmth that made Iolanthe's chest ache. "The CEO of Kensington Creative Consulting, the firm I hired to oversee the entire aesthetic, architectural, and cultural direction of the Austin project." Arthur gestured gracefully to Clara. The silence that fell over Iolanthe was absolute. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "You?" Iolanthe whispered, staring at his ex-wife. "You're heading the Austin project? But you appraise art. You don't know commercial architecture." "I spent 15 years editing every single proposal, blueprint, and pitch you ever created, Iolanthe," Clara said softly, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying clarity. "I know exactly what works, what fails, and most importantly, I know exactly what corners you cut when you're desperate for margins. The Austin project requires a visionary who understands integration, not just a man trying to inflate his own ego with glass and steel." She took a slow sip of her champagne. "And I have already reviewed your firm's preliminary portfolio, Iolanthe. It was quietly submitted to my office last week by your increasingly panicked junior partners." Iolanthe felt the blood drain from his face. "And?" Clara looked at him, her gaze utterly devoid of pity. It was derivative, uninspired. It looked exactly like the work of a man who has lost his muse. "Your firm will not be receiving the contract, Iolanthe. In fact, you aren't even on the short list." The oxygen completely vanished from the plaza's grand ballroom. Iolanthe stood frozen in the golden light of the baccarat chandeliers, staring at the woman he had discarded like an outdated accessory. The music of the string quartet, a lively, elegant Vivaldi piece, suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge in his ears. He tried to draw breath, but his chest felt tightly bound in iron. "Not on the short list," Iolanthe repeated, the words tasting like copper on his tongue. He sounded hollow, a man speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. "Clara, you can't be serious. Sterling Associates has a 20-year pedigree. You know my work. You built that firm with me." "Exactly," Clara replied, her voice maintaining that terrifying, silken calm. She didn't look angry. She looked completely and utterly unbothered, which was infinitely worse. "I built the foundation that allowed you to play the visionary. I smoothed over the insults you hurled at the zoning boards. I rewrote the arrogant, condescending proposals you drafted for the city planners. I know your work, Iolanthe, better than you know it yourself. And your recent submission for the Austin Tech campus was a tragedy. It was derivative, bloated, and entirely devoid of the ecological empathy Meister Kensington's board demanded." Arthur Kensington stood beside her, a monolith of quiet, lethal authority in his midnight blue tuxedo. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. He simply watched Iolanthe with the detached, clinical interest of a scientist observing a particularly slow, dying insect. "You did this out of spite," Iolanthe hissed, his panic overriding his survival instincts. He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a desperate, ugly rasp. "You positioned yourself here just to ruin me, to get back at me for leaving." For the first time all evening, Clara's perfect composure broke. She laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, nor was it a cruel one. It was a bright, genuine, musical sound of absolute amusement that cut through the polite murmur of the surrounding billionaires like a crystal bell. A few feet away, real estate magnate Stephen Schwartzman turned his head, raising an eyebrow at the sudden sound, his attention caught by the unfolding drama. Beside him, art dealer Larry Gagosian paused mid-conversation, his sharp eyes darting toward the trio. "Oh, Iolanthe," Clara sighed, a genuine smile playing on her lips, her antique emerald collar catching the light. "You still suffer from such crippling delusions of grandeur. You truly believe the universe revolves around your betrayals. I didn't take the helm of Kensington Creative Consulting to punish you. I took it because I am exceptionally good at what I do, and Arthur recognized a talent that you spent 15 years actively trying to suppress. My success has absolutely nothing to do with you. You are not my nemesis, Iolanthe. You are merely a portfolio I rejected on a Tuesday." The brutal, unvarnished truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He wasn't the villain in her grand tragedy. He was just a minor inconvenience she had already handled. Before Iolanthe could formulate a response, before he could attempt to salvage whatever shred of dignity remained, a violent disruption tore through the elegant crowd. "Richie!" The voice was shrill, slurred, and entirely too loud for the hushed reverence of the VIP circle. Through the sea of understated Oscar de la Renta gowns and bespoke Tom Ford tuxedos, Ivory Davenport stumbled forward. She was a glaring beacon of neon pink sequins in a room dominated by black, white, and muted jewel tones. She held a half-empty flute of Veuve Clicquot in one hand, her other hand aggressively shoving past the shoulder of a prominent European ambassador. She careened to a halt beside Iolanthe, her breath smelling strongly of expensive champagne and cheap tequila, a dangerous concoction she had undoubtedly consumed in the lobby bar. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and fixed with venomous intensity on Clara. "What is taking so long?" Ivory demanded, swaying slightly in her impossibly high stilettos. Champagne sloshed over the rim of her glass, splattering onto the toe of Iolanthe's patent leather shoe. She looked from Iolanthe's ashen, terrified face to Arthur's stoic, unreadable presence, and finally she locked eyes with Clara. Ivory's gaze dragged up and down the custom bias-cut emerald silk, hugging Clara's figure. She took in the flawless, luminous skin, the silvering hair swept into an elegant chignon, and the staggering million-dollar diamonds resting against Clara's collarbone. A vicious, ugly spasm of raw jealousy contorted Ivory's young features. "Is this her?" Ivory sneered, pointing a French manicured acrylic finger practically in Clara's face. "Is this the boring, exhausted ex-wife you're always crying about?" A collective intake of breath rippled through the immediate vicinity. The polite chatter in a 30-foot radius died instantly. Dozens of the most powerful people in Manhattan turned their heads, their eyes fixed on the spectacle. Wendy Murdoch, standing near the ice sculpture, actually stopped speaking entirely, watching with rapt, unabashed fascination. Arthur's jaw locked. The genial host vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless corporate titan who had dismantled entire monopolies. He took a decisive half-step forward, his broad shoulders shielding half of Clara's body, a physical wall between his wife and the erratic, intoxicated younger woman. "Security," Arthur murmured, his voice low but carrying a terrifying, authoritative weight. But Clara placed a gentle, grounding hand on Arthur's forearm, her manicured fingers resting lightly against his dark sleeve. She didn't need a billionaire to fight her battles. She was entirely in her element. "Hello, Ivory," Clara said. Her voice was as smooth and cool as marble. "It is a genuine pleasure to finally meet the woman who liberated me." Ivory blinked, her alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process the insult masked beneath the elegant greeting. She scowled, her face flushing a mottled, angry red. "Liberated you? Please," Ivory scoffed. An ugly, grating sound. She took another aggressive step forward, ignoring Iolanthe's frantic attempts to grab her elbow. "Richie left you because you were ancient history. He told me himself. You couldn't keep up. You just got lucky and found some billionaire sugar daddy to buy you shiny things." "Ivory, for the love of God, shut your mouth," Iolanthe hissed, his fingers digging painfully into her upper arm. He was sweating profusely now, completely terrified of the power radiating from the man standing across from him. "You are ruining everything. We need to leave. Right now." "I'm ruining it?" Ivory shrieked, violently yanking her arm out of his grasp. The sheer force of the movement caused her to stumble, nearly twisting her ankle. The alcohol had completely stripped away her thin veneer of high society etiquette, and the undeniable, humiliating superiority of the woman standing before her had shattered her fragile ego. "You're the one who is a total fraud, Iolanthe," Ivory screamed, her voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the plaza. "You think I don't know? You think I'm stupid? Your accountant called my cell phone yesterday because your Amex Black Card was declined at Balthazar. You promised me a life of luxury. You promised we were flying private to St. Bart's for New Year's, and instead you're bouncing checks for the Soho loft. Your car is months behind on payments, and you're dragging me to this depressing snobfest just so you can beg your ex-wife for a job." The silence that followed her outburst was absolute, deafening, and completely suffocating. It was a public execution. The whispered rumors of Iolanthe Sterling's financial struggles were no longer whispers. They had been broadcasted at maximum volume to the exact people he needed to impress. He closed his eyes, a profound, soul-crushing humiliation washing over him like a tidal wave of acid. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. The great architect, the master of the universe, was publicly exposed as a desperate, bankrupt imposter drowning in his own hubris. Clara looked at the younger woman. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look vindictive. As her eyes swept over Ivory's trembling lip, her tear-streaked mascara, and her defensive, terrified posture, Clara's expression softened into something incredibly rare in that ballroom. Genuine, profound pity. "He isn't going to marry you, Ivory," Clara said. She pitched her voice so that it was quiet, intimate, meant only for the four of them, cutting through the heavy silence with surgical precision. "He is drowning," Clara continued, her eyes locking onto Ivory's with a fierce, motherly intensity. "He will drain his last dime, trying to keep you entertained, trying to buy the illusion of his own youth through you. And when the money is entirely gone, and it sounds like it already is, he will blame you for all of his failures. Because a man who cannot bear to look at his own reflection will always look for a mirror to smash." Ivory stared at Clara, her mouth slightly open, the fight completely draining out of her. "You are 24 years old," Clara said softly. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Do not spend your best years being the life raft for a man who drilled the holes in his own boat. Walk away, Ivory, while you still have your dignity." Ivory looked from Clara's calm, empathetic face to Iolanthe. Iolanthe was staring at the intricate patterns of the marble floor, his shoulders hunched, completely defeated. He didn't defend himself. He didn't defend her. He just stood there, a broken, empty shell of the man she thought she had conquered. With a choked, pathetic sob of rage and overwhelming embarrassment, Ivory hurled her champagne glass. It shattered against the base of the swan ice sculpture, sending shards of crystal and expensive alcohol flying across the floor. She turned on her heel and sprinted back through the parted crowd, her neon dress disappearing into the sea of black and white, running desperately towards the coat check. Iolanthe didn't move to follow her. He was entirely paralyzed. From the shadows near the grand staircase, two men materialized. They did not wear the standard hotel security uniforms. They wore tailored dark suits with discreet earpieces. Arthur's private detail. They moved with absolute, silent efficiency, stepping smoothly up to flank Iolanthe on either side. "Mr. Sterling," the taller of the two men said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that offered zero room for negotiation. "It is time for you to leave the premises." Iolanthe slowly raised his head. He looked at Clara one last time. He wanted to see a spark of the woman who used to brew him chamomile tea when he worked late. He wanted to see anger, hatred, triumph, anything to prove that he still mattered enough to elicit an emotional reaction. He wanted to know that his absence had left a scar. Instead, Clara simply turned her back to him. She slipped her arm gracefully through Arthur's, the emerald silk pooling perfectly at her feet. She leaned slightly towards the European ambassador, picking up the thread of their interrupted conversation in flawless, rapid-fire French, as if Iolanthe Sterling had simply evaporated into thin air. He was escorted out of the Plaza Hotel, not with a dramatic struggle, but in complete, pathetic silence, the heavy brass doors closing behind him to lock him out in the freezing November rain. The physical expulsion from the Plaza Hotel was only the prologue to a much longer, infinitely more agonizing unraveling. The ride back to the Soho loft in the back of a black Suburban was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, angry tapping of Ivory's acrylic nails against her illuminated phone screen. Iolanthe stared out the rain-slicked window at the blur of Manhattan streetlights, a cold, leaden weight settling in the pit of his stomach. His sartorial armor, the bespoke tuxedo, the imported silk tie, suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He had walked into the Kensington Winter Gala, believing he was one handshake away from salvation. He was leaving as a complete pariah. In the hyper-connected, gossip-fueled ecosystem of New York's ultra-wealthy, word of his public humiliation at the hands of his ex-wife and his erratic girlfriend would spread before the caterers even finished clearing the champagne flutes. When they reached the loft, the silence shattered. Ivory didn't just yell. She unleashed a torrential downpour of vitriol that stripped away the last remaining illusions of their romance. "You are a joke, Iolanthe!" she screamed, hurling her metallic clutch across the kitchen island where it shattered a crystal vase. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? You stood there shaking like a beaten dog while your boring ancient ex-wife looked at me like I was trash on her shoe. You told me she was a nobody." "She was a nobody," Iolanthe roared back, his own panic manifesting as rage. "She appraised dusty paintings. How was I supposed to know she was sleeping with Arthur Kensington? She isn't just sleeping with him, you idiot. She's running his billion-dollar project. The project you've been crying about for 6 months, Ivory scoffed, a sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked him up and down, her lip curled in a sneer that aged her beautiful face by a decade. "My friends warned me. They told me you were just playing rich, that your firm was a sinking ship. I defended you, but you're just a broke, washed-up, middle-aged man who can't even afford my Bergdorf bill." Iolanthe felt the air leave his lungs. "Is that all I am to you? A credit card?" Ivory let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "What did you think this was, Iolanthe? True love. You left a 15-year marriage because you wanted a shiny new toy to make you feel young. Well, toys are expensive, and you're out of funds." She stormed into the master bedroom and slammed the door. That night, Iolanthe slept on the Italian leather sofa he had bought to appease her, staring at the ceiling, the ghost of Clara's Baccarat Rouge perfume still haunting his senses. The professional execution commenced at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday morning. Iolanthe walked into the glass-walled conference room of Sterling Associates, nursing a massive tension headache, only to find his 3 junior partners already seated. At the head of the table sat Simon Barrett, a man Iolanthe had personally mentored. Simon did not look up when Iolanthe entered. He simply slid a thick, bound legal folder across the polished mahogany. "What is this, Simon?" Iolanthe asked, his voice rough. "It's a buyout agreement, Iolanthe," Simon said, his tone entirely clinical. "We are invoking the morality and liability clause in our partnership charter. We want you out." Iolanthe gripped the back of his chair, the leather creaking under his white-knuckled grip. "You can't be serious. I built this firm. My name is on the door." "Your name is poison," another partner interjected quietly. "We received calls this morning from the Guggenheim Board and the Kensington Foundation. Not only are we entirely blacklisted from the Austin Tech campus bid, but 2 of our current luxury residential clients pulled their retainers at 8 a.m. today. They attended the gala, Iolanthe. They saw the scene. More importantly, they saw that Arthur Kensington wouldn't even shake your hand." Simon leaned forward, folding his hands. "You spent the last 2 years chasing a 20-something Instagram model, while the firm's actual administrative and diplomatic backbone, Clara, was gone. You've been coasting on Old Glory, burning through capital, and making us all look arrogant and incompetent. Sign the papers, take the severance, which frankly is barely enough to cover the firm's current debts, and walk away. Or we will dissolve the entity entirely and leave you with the commercial lease liabilities." It was a flawless, bloodless coup. By noon, Iolanthe Sterling was officially unemployed, escorted out of the building he had designed, carrying a single cardboard box. When he returned to the Soho loft, he found the front door ajar. Inside, the massive walk-in closet had been thoroughly eviscerated. Ivory was gone. She had taken her designer bags, her jewelry, and the custom espresso machine. On the marble counter, pinned beneath a past-due notice from Con Edison, was a bright pink sticky note. "Miami is calling. Good luck paying the rent." C. The descent from the penthouse to the pavement was terrifyingly swift. Without the firm's income, Iolanthe's personal finances, already stretched to the breaking point by Ivory's insatiable demands and the brutal divorce settlement he had forced upon Clara, completely collapsed. His leased Porsche was repossessed from the underground parking garage 3 weeks later. 2 months after that, the eviction notice was taped to the door of the Soho loft. Desperation breeds delusion. In a final, frantic attempt to save himself, Iolanthe convinced himself he possessed a trump card. During their marriage, Clara had frequently sketched conceptual designs while sitting at the kitchen island, offering them to Iolanthe to incorporate into his blueprints. He remembered a specific, innovative, biophilic design, a way of integrating living root systems into structural retaining walls that he was certain Clara was now using for the Austin Tech campus. He scraped together his last few $1,000s to hire a sleazy intellectual property litigator, intending to file an injunction against Kensington Creative Consulting for IP theft. He didn't actually want to go to trial. He wanted to extort a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement from Arthur Kensington to make the nuisance lawsuit disappear. A meeting was arranged at the towering glass headquarters of Kensington Holdings in Midtown. Iolanthe arrived in a slightly wrinkled suit, his heart pounding with toxic adrenaline. He was ushered into a sterile, windowless boardroom. Arthur Kensington did not attend. Clara did not attend. Instead, Iolanthe found himself sitting across from Harrison Caldwell, the chief legal counsel for the Kensington Empire, a man whose reputation for completely destroying his opponents was legendary. Caldwell, a silver-haired shark in a charcoal pinstripe suit, didn't even offer Iolanthe a glass of water. He simply opened a slim manila envelope and pulled out a single, neatly typed document, turning it around so Iolanthe could read it. Iolanthe squinted at the paper. It was a page from his own divorce settlement, dated 3 years prior. "I don't understand," Iolanthe stammered. "What is this?" "This, Mr. Sterling, is Addendum B of your finalized divorce decree," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with aristocratic boredom. "A brilliant little clause inserted by Miss Hayes's attorney, which you, in your immense rush to finalize the proceedings and run off with your young paramour, signed without having your own counsel properly review." Iolanthe's eyes scanned the dense legalese. His blood ran cold. "In exchanging her equity in Sterling Associates for a lump sum," Caldwell translated smoothly, Miss Hayes demanded, "a blanket waiver releasing her from any and all intellectual property claims regarding concepts, sketches, or designs discussed during your marriage. You explicitly signed away your right to ever claim ownership over her ideas. In fact, if you attempt to file this frivolous injunction, this document triggers a penalty clause that makes you liable for all of our legal fees." Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Iolanthe's with terrifying intensity. "Clara knew exactly what she was doing, Iolanthe. She anticipated your desperation years before you even felt it. She outplayed you before the game even started." The lawyer stood up, buttoning his jacket. "If you ever contact Miss Hayes, Mr. Kensington, or any subsidiary of this holding company again, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life tied up in litigation so expensive you won't be able to afford a bus ticket. Good day, Mr. Sterling." That was the moment the narcissistic collapse became absolute. There were no more moves to make on the board. He had been checkmated by the very woman he had discarded for being too simple. 4 years melted away like snow on a warm grate. Iolanthe downsized again, and then again, finally landing in a cramped, dark, one-bedroom apartment in a noisy, industrial neighborhood in Queens. He found piecemeal work as a freelance draftsperson for a strip mall developer, correcting blueprints for chain restaurants and discount shoe stores. He gained weight, his hair thinned to nothing. He became a ghost haunting his own life. Conversely, Clara Hayes became a titan. The Austin Tech campus opened to international fanfare, winning the Pritzker Architecture Prize, the very award Iolanthe had spent his entire life dreaming of. It was hailed as a masterpiece of modern, sustainable design. Clara didn't just design buildings, she curated environments. Following the success in Austin, she and Arthur were married in a strictly private, highly guarded ceremony in a historic villa overlooking Lake Como. There were no tabloid leaks, no flashy magazine spreads, just the quiet, impenetrable security of massive wealth and genuine love. On a miserable, freezing Tuesday in November, exactly 7 years to the day after he had stood in his penthouse kitchen and told Clara she was suffocating him, Iolanthe sat in a cheap, neon-lit diner in Queens. The heating was broken, and he kept his damp wool coat zipped to his chin as he nursed a lukewarm, bitter coffee. The waitress, clearing the booth next to him, left behind a discarded copy of the Wall Street Journal. Iolanthe pulled the paper toward him out of sheer habit. He flipped past the market summaries and opened the mansion section. The breath was violently punched from his lungs. Staring back at him was a full-page spread. It featured Clara. She was standing on the sun-drenched stone balcony of the newly acquired Kensington estate in the south of France, the azure waters of the Mediterranean sprawling behind her. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, wide-leg linen suit, her hair loose and silvering beautifully at the temples. She looked impossibly radiant, exuding a quiet, terrifying power. Beside her, slightly out of focus but undeniably present, stood Arthur Kensington, looking at his wife with a reverence that bordered on worship. The headline read, "The Quiet Visionary, How Clara Kensington is Redefining the Architecture of Empire." Iolanthe's hands began to shake. He read the article, every word feeling like a physical cut. The journalist praised Clara's brilliant mind, her flawless taste, and the deep, collaborative partnership she shared with her billionaire husband. The article mentioned, only in passing, that she had once been married to a local Manhattan architect, a footnote in her sweeping, magnificent history. He was a footnote. Iolanthe dropped the newspaper onto the sticky formica table. The tinny sound of the diner's radio played a pop song he didn't recognize. He looked out the street window at the grey, unforgiving streets of Queens, feeling the absolute, crushing weight of his choices. He realized then the ultimate, devastating truth. He hadn't left a dying fire to find a spark. He had walked out of the sun to chase a firefly. And when the firefly inevitably died, he was left entirely, permanently in the dark, forced to watch the woman he threw away illuminate the world. True revenge is rarely loud. It does not require thrown glasses, vicious rumors, or screaming matches in crowded rooms. True revenge is the quiet, undeniable architecture of a better life. When a person reduces your value to your physical youth or your ability to stroke their ego, the ultimate retaliation is simply removing your light from their world and allowing them to stumble in the darkness they created. Clara's triumph was not just in capturing the heart of a billionaire, but in reclaiming her own brilliant, formidable mind. She proved that while youth is a rapidly depreciating asset, wisdom, grace, and intellect only compound with time. Iolanthe learned the hardest lesson a vain man can learn. When you throw away gold because it doesn't shine like a cheap sequin, you have no one to blame when you end up with nothing but dirt in your hands.